The rain had come early, soft and gray, whispering across the corrugated roofs of the stockyard sheds and gathering in muddy ruts beneath boot heels and hoof prints. The auction yard smelled of wet sawdust and resignation, a place where the unwanted waited to be measured and sold. Men with calloused hands leaned against gates, sipping burnt coffee and talking in low voices, while horses shifted in their pens, nostrils flaring at the scent of cold. No one noticed the old man at first. He arrived without ceremony, his pickup grumbling into the gravel lot with the cough of old lungs. Gideon Brooks stepped out slowly, joints protesting, coat flapping like a forgotten flag in the wind. His boots sank slightly into the mud, but he didn't bother to adjust them. He stood for a moment, letting the rain touch the brim of his hat, eyes sweeping the pens as if searching for something he hadn't quite defined yet. There was a limp to his walk, faint but consistent, more from habit than pain now. Years ago, it had been a bullet. Now it was just memory anchoring bone. Gideon passed by rows of geldings and mares, many of them young and polished, their coats slick with sweat and oil, eyes bright with confusion. They had names on tags and stories from handlers, champion bloodlines, untapped potential. He paused at none of them. His gaze was always drifting forward, pulled by something quieter than pedigree. He found the horse in the back ring, alone in a pen that smelled of mildew and rust. No tag. No hay. Just a tall, narrow-chested gelding standing rigid in the corner, ears pinned back, one eye swollen shut. The other eye, dark, wary, followed Gideon's approach with the stillness of something that no longer believed in kindness. A man leaned over the rail nearby, chewing a toothpick. That one. Came in with a busted trailer load. Been through 3 handlers. Kicked one clean in the ribs. Ain't worth the rope to tie him down. Gideon didn't answer. He stepped closer, slowly. The horse tensed but didn't bolt. Rain slid down its back, exposing the ridges of its spine beneath a patchy coat. He watched the horse a long while, long enough that the auction bell rang twice in the distance and the men started to drift toward the main ring. Finally, Gideon turned and walked toward the office trailer. Inside, he signed his name on a clipboard without asking the price. The clerk blinked at him. "You haven't even." "I know," Gideon said. "Ring him up." By the time the horse was brought out, the crowd had thickened under the tin roof of the bidding shed. Laughter hummed at the edges, small, biting. The announcer tapped his microphone and cleared his throat. Lot 47. 1 gelding. Untagged. Unknown history. One-eyed and lame. Let's start at 50. Gideon raised his hand. No one else did. The gavel fell with a hollow crack. Sold for $50 to the gentleman with the cane. More chuckles, someone muttering, "Poor bastard," and then the moment was over. The crowd shifted back to their programs, already forgetting. Gideon approached the holding pen. The horse, now haltered with fraying rope, watched him like a man might watch a closing door, tight with suspicion and a trace of old pain. The rain turned heavier, drumming on the trailer roof as Gideon coaxed the horse up the ramp. It hesitated only once, then climbed with the careful stiffness of something that had been forced too often. He didn't speak during the ride home. The wipers squeaked, the heater rattled, and outside the window the world blurred into mist and fence posts. Inside, the smell of wet horse and old wool filled the cabin. Gideon glanced at the rearview mirror more than once, though the horse was invisible behind the closed trailer. He pulled up to the ranch just as twilight thinned the edge of the sky. The place wasn't much, an old barn half covered in ivy, a crooked porch swing hanging by one chain, and enough pasture to forget your name for a little while. He backed the trailer toward the paddock, dropped the gate, and stepped aside. The horse didn't move. Rain pooled at the lip of the ramp. Gideon waited, not with impatience, but with the stillness of someone who knew how to wait. After several minutes, the gelding stepped down, each hoof a tentative sound in the mud. He bolted once, half a panic turn, then stopped, breathing hard. Gideon didn't approach. He just stood, hand at his side, letting the space between them stretch. The wind carried the sound of distant thunder. "You're not the only one with ghosts," Gideon murmured. The horse flicked one ear. That night, Gideon set up a lean-to in the corner of the paddock, near the fence line. He left the barn doors open, but he didn't lead the horse in. Instead, he brought out a bucket of oats, placed it near the gate, and sat in the dirt beside it, the coat bunched under him. He didn't sleep, not really. He watched the rain ease into mist and listened to the soft crunch of hooves in wet grass. By morning, the bucket was empty. The horse stood a little closer than before. Days passed. Gideon fixed a broken hinge on the barn door, repaired a busted fence rail, planted carrots. He didn't speak to the horse often, but he made sure his steps were always heard. No surprises. No loud gestures. He whistled sometimes, tuneless things, more breath than song. The horse, still unnamed, watched from the edge of shadow. Neighbors noticed. May Pollard from 3 ranches over stopped by with a pan of cornbread. She looked over the fence, shook her head. "Heard you bought the devil's throwaway." "He's just lost," Gideon replied. "Ain't we all?" May said quietly. On the 5th day, Gideon stood in the paddock with a bridle in one hand. He didn't lift it. Just stood there. The horse came within 10 paces. Then 8. That night, the wind turned colder. Leaves rattled across the pasture, and lightning stitched the sky. Thunder rolled low and mean. The horse paced, ears flat, breath rising in white gusts. Gideon stepped into the paddock barefoot, coat over his shoulders, hair silver in the stormlight. He didn't carry rope. He didn't carry reins. He walked slowly to the center and waited. The horse circled twice, wild-eyed, trembling. "I ain't gonna tie you," Gideon said softly. "I've had enough of that myself." It took 10 minutes. Then 15. And then the horse approached, nostrils flaring, sides heaving. He pressed his wet forehead into Gideon's chest. Neither of them moved for a long, long time. The next morning, the paddock was still soaked, the barn steaming with the breath of shelter. The horse lay in the straw, ribs moving slow. Gideon stood nearby, leaning on the rail, coffee in hand. He didn't smile, not really. But his eyes held something, quiet, unfamiliar. He took a slow sip and said to the wind, "Maybe we'll give this sorry world one more go." And the horse, still nameless, flicked his tail once, then closed his one good eye. The ranch was silent except for birdsong and the creak of an old swing finding its rhythm in the breeze. The mornings came slow and blue at Gideon's ranch, spread wide under a canvas of whispering cottonwoods and lingering dew. The grass held the weight of night's breath long after the sun crested the hills, and every sound, birdsong, hoof-step, rustle of leaves, seemed to tread gently, as if afraid to disturb something still healing. Rust had begun to roam. Not far, not freely, but far enough that Gideon stopped counting his steps. The horse no longer stood like a monument to old suffering in the back corner of the paddock. He grazed near the fence now, twitching his ears at birds and, sometimes, lifting his head when Gideon passed, as though considering whether to follow. Trust was a quiet thing. Gideon never reached for it, only made room for it. He rose early each day, his knees groaning with the effort, to tend the small garden behind the barn. Carrots were finally sprouting, thin and foolish-looking, and he spoke to them as he worked, low mutters about frost and rabbits and how nothing worth keeping comes easy. He did not speak to the horse unless the moment asked for it. Mostly, he spoke as if the horse weren't listening at all, though he knew better. On the 6th morning, Rust nosed the feed bucket while Gideon was still pouring oats. Neither of them startled. Later that week, the old man stood beside the horse for a full minute without a flinch. He let his fingers graze the edge of Rust's shoulder, rough hide beneath rougher palms. The touch didn't last, but it stayed. That evening, Gideon sat on the porch with a battered notebook and a pen that refused to flow unless coaxed. He stared at the page, tapping the pen against his thigh. Across the yard, Rust stood under the tree where Gideon's boy once hung a tire swing. Before the war, before the uniform, before the flag was folded in someone else's trembling hands. A name had been carved into the wood of that swing. Caleb. Gideon's only son. The name still showed through the flakes of red paint, faded by time but not yet erased. "You'd have liked him," Gideon whispered. Penn paused in midair. "He had your kind of wild." The horse shifted, as though answering a call he hadn't heard in years. Rust bore his own bruises, some visible, some only evident in the silence between footsteps. There was a notch in his left ear and a long, white scar behind the saddle line. He froze when birds flew too fast, when boots scraped wood, when the wind caught the door just wrong. Gideon recognized that kind of memory. He'd lived beside it for decades. The barn had a side stall, rarely used since the last good horse died. Gideon cleaned it out, coughing through the dust and mouse droppings, laying fresh straw with hands that hadn't built anything in years. He left the door open, not to invite but to welcome. On the third night, Rust stepped inside on his own. He didn't lie down, but he stood facing the wall, unmoving. Progress looked like failure until you saw it twice. May returned with soup and stories, her voice low and kind as always. She stood on the porch, watching the horse from behind a steaming mug. "You know," she said gently, "some things are broken for good." Gideon didn't argue. He just watched the horse and then said, "So am I." She didn't press. Just left the soup, touched his shoulder briefly, and walked back into the dusk. That night, Gideon dreamt of gunfire and galloping hooves, of Caleb's laughter in the barn and the dull thud of a telegram hitting the floor. He woke before dawn, sweat clinging to his back, hand clenched around the sheet. Rust stood by the fence when Gideon stepped out, as if summoned by grief itself. The days blurred into a rhythm, slow and tender and strange. Gideon began working with a rope halter again, not to restrain but to suggest. He held it out, let Rust smell it. The horse didn't bolt. He draped it over the fence rail. Eventually, he looped it around Rust's neck without tension. Once, during a particularly quiet dusk, he placed the old cavalry saddle on Rust's back. Not tightened, just rested. The horse shivered, but didn't flinch. Gideon stepped back, gave him the space to breathe. That night, he slept sounder than he had in years. It wasn't just trust forming between man and horse. It was recognition. They had seen something alike in each other, though neither had the words to name it. Sometimes, the healing was interrupted. A boy from town, Sam, May's nephew, came to visit one afternoon. He threw a rock toward the paddock, not out of meanness but ignorance. The sound cracked sharp against a fence post. Rust bolted, eyes wide, chest heaving. He slammed into the gate hard enough to bleed. Gideon didn't shout. He didn't scold the boy. He just turned to him, kneeling. "Some creatures break different," he said. "You don't fix them by pushing." The boy nodded, tears welling, and whispered, "Sorry." That night, Gideon stayed with Rust, wiping the blood gently with warm water and quiet hands. The horse didn't pull away. In town, word had begun to spread. They called it the Pity Project, some smirking, others curious. May defended him when folks spoke too loudly. "He's not training the horse," she told them. "They're unbreaking each other." One morning, the sun rose so golden it made the world look brand new. Gideon stepped outside and found Rust already waiting, as if the horse had been watching the door. Gideon raised a hand. Rust didn't flinch. Instead, he pressed forward, nudging Gideon's chest, breathing slow and steady. There was a photo on the mantel in Gideon's house, Caleb on horseback, grinning with a ribbon in hand, the same tree in the background. Gideon looked at it often now, not with sorrow, but something that almost resembled gratitude. He started writing again in that notebook. Just a line here and there. Notes on feed, changes in posture, what songs the horse seemed to like best. But also fragments. Rust, like iron left in the rain. Not broken. Changed. Still holding. Still here. One day, after a long walk across the property, Gideon took Rust to the edge of the orchard. The trees bloomed early that year, pale white blossoms falling like soft snow. He removed the halter and let the horse wander. Rust didn't run. He stayed close, walking slowly behind Gideon as if tethered by something more lasting than rope. The orchard had once been Caleb's favorite spot. Now, the blossoms swirled around them like a blessing neither had asked for. Gideon sat beneath the old apple tree and began to hum a tune he couldn't remember learning. Rust lowered his head, sniffed at the grass, then lay beside him. Gideon felt the warmth of the sun on his face, the steady breath of the horse beside him. And for the first time in years, the silence felt like peace, not punishment. "I don't know what brought you to that auction," he said softly, fingers brushing the curve of Rust's neck. "But I'm damn glad you came." The wind stirred the trees gently, and petals floated down over them both. Behind them, the house stood quiet. The swing creaked once in the breeze, then stilled. The garden sprouted. The earth turned. And something unnamed, but not unseen, was beginning again. By the time summer carved its heat into the earth, the orchard's blossoms had turned to fruit, and the grass beneath Gideon's boots gave a little with every step. Rust now followed him without halter or rope, his movements no longer stiff with suspicion but marked by a quiet alertness, like he'd finally decided the world might not always be cruel. They worked in rhythm. Gideon didn't push. He asked. Saddling came next. First light, then weight, then movement. Rust accepted each step not with ease, but with deliberation, like a veteran learning to breathe again after the smoke clears. Some days, the horse walked alongside the saddle without ever letting it rest on his back. Other days, Gideon cinched it and leaned against him, whispering things too old and soft for anyone but the wind. That quiet was broken when May arrived with the flyer. She waved it from the fence line, the edges flapping in the breeze. "Figured you might want to see this," she said, her tone a careful mix of casual and hopeful. He took the paper without comment. The flyer was hand-drawn, posted by the local chapter of the Veterans Riders Association. A trail parade. Small event. Nothing competitive. Just a gathering of those who had worn the uniform, marching in peace this time, mounted or not. The honor ride. A fundraiser. A tribute. And a chance to show up for something again. Gideon stared at the ink for a long time, barely noticing Rust step forward and rest his head near the man's shoulder. "You ought to go," May said. "You. Him. Both of you deserve to be seen." He didn't respond, not right away. The flyer fluttered once in his fingers, then folded slowly, neatly, and disappeared into his coat pocket. That night, he pulled his old uniform from a cedar chest, unfolding it like a memory he wasn't sure he wanted back. The sleeves were worn, buttons dulled, but it still held shape. He brushed it off in silence, then laid it across the foot of the bed. The next morning began before the sun had time to stretch. Gideon took Rust on a longer ride, past the orchard, through the dry creek and up to the ridge. The saddle sat firm. No panic. No resistance. Only the steady beat of hooves and the occasional snort as Rust tasted the wind. Halfway through the ride, a truck passed down the far road. Rust froze, head jerking. Gideon stilled. "No one's chasing you," he whispered, reaching forward. "We're not running now." It took a minute, but Rust didn't bolt. He didn't spin. Just stood there trembling, waiting for the noise to pass. Small victory. They trained every day for the next 2 weeks. No drills. No discipline. Just acclamation. Gideon clanged metal pans. "Let the radio play." He walked Rust past parked cars, through shifting light, beneath a tarp flapping wildly. The horse hesitated, but never fled. The fear never left completely, but it stopped ruling him. When the day came, the fairgrounds buzzed with chatter and lawn chairs, banners swinging above trailers and hay bales. Flags waved gently along the fence posts, and children darted through the crowd with cotton candy fingers and wide eyes. Rust stepped off the trailer like a soldier returning from war, not clean, not polished, but upright. Gideon, wearing his old uniform and a hat faded by years of sun, held the reins loosely as they walked toward the gathering ring. He caught stares. Not cruel, not curious, just surprised. One man leaned over to another, murmuring, "That's the horse from the auction yard, isn't it? The broken one?" The other squinted. Can't be. Gideon ignored them. Rust's ears twitched, but his steps never faltered. The riders lined up. Some horses stamped eagerly, muscled and glossy with showmanship. Others were aging, swaybacked, carried by men whose knees had long stopped cooperating. All of them bore the colors of memory. Patches, pins, old scars hiding in the tilt of a hat or the slope of a shoulder. The honor ride began with a bugle note, high and clear. Riders moved in procession, looping the fairground in a slow, steady walk. Gideon rode Rust near the middle, not hiding, not leading. Just there. Present. Rust's gait was uneven at first, but settled as they rounded the first bend. Applause rose from the crowd, scattered and respectful. Then a flag fell. A child near the fence lost grip. A small red-white-blue cloth fluttered down beside the track with a sharp snap of impact against dirt. Rust skidded to a halt, muscles taut, eyes wide. A second of stillness passed. Gideon didn't speak. He didn't pull. He leaned forward, pressing his hand gently against Rust's neck. His voice was low, just above breath. It's not a whip. It's not a trap. Just wind, old boy. Just wind. Rust trembled. The world seemed to hold its breath. And then he stepped forward. 1, 2. Continued. The crowd did not erupt. It didn't need to. Something deeper moved through them, an exhale of shared understanding, like watching a man take a step after years in bed. May clapped first, soft but certain. When the ride ended, Rust stood quietly beside Gideon near the exit gate. Children approached, hesitantly. Gideon gave no warning, offered no instructions. Rust lowered his head, allowed his muzzle to be touched. A girl reached up, placed a daisy behind his ear. May brought lemonade. Gideon took it with a nod, his uniform damp with sweat and memory. You proved them wrong, she said. Didn't do it to prove anything, Gideon replied, eyes on the horse. Did it to remember who we are when no one's watching. The sun dipped low, stretching long shadows across the ring. Trailers rumbled. Horses were led away. The crowd thinned. But a few remained. A man in a clean button-down, soft-spoken, approached Gideon near the water trough. Name's Parker. I run a riding school in the next county. Mostly for troubled kids, trauma cases. I saw your ride. I was wondering. Gideon raised a brow. He's not for sale. No, Parker smiled. I wouldn't ask. I was wondering if you and your horse might come by sometime. Maybe meet the kids. Let them see what healing looks like. The silence that followed was full, but not heavy. Rust stepped forward, as if answering before Gideon could. We'll think on it, Gideon said. But I reckon he might have more to teach than I do. They loaded Rust into the trailer under the orange light of evening, the sky painted with streaks of tired gold. May leaned against the truck door, arms folded. You gonna write this one down? She asked. Maybe, Gideon said. But it ain't over yet. She smiled. No. I guess it's just beginning. They drove home in silence, windows down, letting the wind tangle their hair and carry away the old ghosts. Back at the ranch, Gideon opened the gate and let Rust walk himself into the paddock. The horse didn't hesitate. He went straight to the tree and stood beneath it, still wearing the daisy behind his ear. Inside the house, Gideon opened the notebook again. He wrote without pause this time, the ink flowing smooth, the words steady. He did not leap. He did not run. He simply walked toward the noise and trusted I would be there. He closed the book, placed it beside the photo of Caleb, and leaned back in his chair, listening to the crickets tune their song. Outside, Rust lifted his head to the stars. Not searching, not startled. Just looking. And somewhere between the hush of night and the creak of the old swing on the porch, the world felt changed. Not louder, not brighter, just better. The town didn't erupt overnight, but something shifted, quiet and deliberate, like snow melting in the eaves of old barns. The honor ride had come and gone, and with it, the usual parade banners and leftover lemonade cups. But Gideon and Rust hadn't slipped back into obscurity. Not this time. It started with a photograph. Someone had captured it. Gideon astride Rust, both still as sunrise, a little girl's hand resting against the horse's jaw, Daisy behind his ear like a coronation. The photo ended up on the bulletin board at the diner, next to lost dog posters and flyers for church picnics. Then the library. Then the local newspaper, tucked under the fold with a headline that read, "Old Wounds, New Roads." May saw it first and clipped it out. "You made page 4, she said, sliding it across Gideon's porch table one morning. Not bad for a man who didn't say a word for 15 years unless it was to tell folks to go away. Gideon looked at the grainy photo, the bend of his shoulders, the way Rust's head tilted slightly toward the girl. He didn't smile, but the corners of his eyes crinkled. "I remember the girl," he said. "She didn't say a thing. Just walked right up like he was her friend already." Maybe he was. Word reached further than the diner and the post office. A high school teacher called one afternoon asking if she could bring her class out for a field trip. "We're covering resilience and recovery," she said. "Thought it might do the kids good to see it living and breathing." Gideon hesitated, then said she could come on Thursday if they brought apples. The following week, a battered van pulled up to the gate. A dozen teens climbed out, all knees and skepticism, their phones up before they even made it to the paddock fence. Rust stood under the apple tree, head high, watching them with mild curiosity. He didn't flinch when they approached. He didn't shy when the closest boy, tall, skinny, with sleeves pulled down to hide scars, reached forward with a trembling hand. Rust leaned into him. The teacher watched from a distance, hands clasped tight at her waist. Gideon leaned on the fence, arms crossed, gaze unreadable. "He doesn't do tricks," Gideon said, breaking the silence. "He doesn't need to," the boy murmured. They came again the next month. And then again. One girl asked if she could sketch him for her art project. A boy in a wheelchair asked if Rust had ever been afraid of falling. Gideon said yes, every day. The boy nodded and said, "Me too." One Saturday, the town organized a cleanup for the old Veterans Center. Brush cleared, windows washed, new paint ordered. No one mentioned Gideon's name, but most of them had seen the ride, and even those who hadn't knew about the man with the broken horse who made something beautiful from bruises. May brought muffins and a hammer. Gideon brought nails and didn't talk much, but he stayed all day. Later, May stood beside him, sweat streaking her neck. "Funny, isn't it? What is? How sometimes the softest sound carries the farthest. You didn't yell, didn't beg. Just showed up with a horse that shouldn't trust anyone and let folks see what healing looks like." Gideon didn't answer, but he turned to look at Rust, grazing beneath a sky thick with light, and gave a soft, thoughtful nod. Letters began arriving. Some from veterans who'd read about him in the regional bulletin. Others from parents, therapists, strangers who'd seen the picture online. One woman from 3 counties overwrote, "My daughter hasn't spoken in 2 months, but she smiled when I showed her your photo. We're learning again. One word, one breath. Thank you." He kept the letters in a shoebox beneath the kitchen table. One afternoon, as summer began to thin into gold, Gideon brought Rust to a riding center on the outskirts of town, Parker's Place. There were ramps built for accessibility, fences painted in soft hues, and a chalkboard sign that read, "Welcome home. Everyone's worth the saddle." Parker met them at the gate. "Didn't expect you back so soon." Gideon nodded toward Rust. "He's been asking." They let the kids come one at a time. Rust stood motionless for every mount, every awkward shift of weight, every accidental tug. One girl laughed when she dropped the reins and he didn't move. "He knows," she said. "He just knows." That day, a boy with tremors traced Rust's scar with one finger and whispered, "I'm not scared of mine anymore." Afterward, Gideon sat in a folding chair beneath the awning, watching the sun lower itself over the hills. Parker walked over, 2 coffees in hand. "I think he was made for this," Parker said. Gideon took the cup. I think we both were. And still, life went on. Fences broke. Storms came. Rust colicked one night and Gideon sat beside him, humming low and tuneless, waiting through the dark. The vet came. Said it would be close. Gideon didn't sleep. But Rust made it. In the spring, Gideon opened the paddock gate and found a boy waiting there. Not from a program. Not from a school. Just a kid. Maybe 10. With freckles and knobby knees and a book in his hand. My dad says you saved that horse. Gideon raised an eyebrow. Your dad exaggerates. The boy grinned. Can I read to him? Rust stood near the fence, ears flicking. Gideon nodded. Guess you'll have to ask him. The boy read 3 pages of Black Beauty before Rust lowered his head and breathed into the boy's shoulder. From then on, the kid came every Sunday. Gideon never asked his name. The boy never asked his. They didn't need to. Years passed, but the story didn't fade. It was retold in different voices, passed down over pie counters and barber chairs, added to textbooks in classrooms and whispered on late-night walks. Remember the man who bought the broken horse? They'd say. The one no one wanted. And always, he didn't fix him. They fixed each other. Gideon aged, as men do. His hair thinned, his gait slowed, and his breath grew shorter with each winter. But his eyes stayed sharp. When people asked if he was all right, he'd say, still riding, and tap his chest. On his last birthday, the town threw a picnic at the fairgrounds. There were banners and fiddles, lemonade, and laughter. Rust walked in beside Gideon, now white-faced and slower but proud. The children had painted his hooves gold. One girl climbed onto the stage and read aloud, We give thanks to the ones who see past scars, who don't walk away from broken things, who know that healing isn't loud, it's steady, like hoofbeats returning home. No one cried, but no one didn't feel it. That night, back at the ranch, Gideon stood by the fence, hand resting on Rust's mane. You did good, he said. More than I ever did. The horse blinked slowly, leaned into him. Gideon sighed, the sound deep and clean, and looked out across the field. Fireflies blinked along the edge of the grass. The house lights glowed like memory. And the swing, old and worn, creaked once, then settled into stillness. The stars rose. The wind moved. And somewhere out beyond the ridge, in the hush of open land, the story kept going. Not louder, not brighter. Just better. Just enough.